The piercing shriek of the code blue alarm shattered the pre-dawn silence of St. Catherine's Hospital ICU like a knife through glass. Maya Rodriguez's sneakers squeaked against the polished linoleum as she sprinted down the dimly lit corridor, her stethoscope bouncing against her chest with each urgent step. Room 314. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she burst through the doorway at exactly 3:47 a.m., according to the digital clock glowing red above the patient's bed. Harold Chen, 73 years old, lay motionless against stark white sheets, his normally peaceful face now slack and gray. Maya's trained eyes took in everything in 2 seconds flat. No chest movement, lips tinged blue, the heart monitor showing nothing but a flat, damning line. "Mr. Chen!" Maya called out, her voice cutting through the sudden silence as she reached for his wrist, feeling desperately for a pulse that wasn't there. Without hesitation, she tilted his head back, checked his airway, and began chest compressions with the precise rhythm drilled into her during countless training sessions. 1, 2, 3, 4, the mechanical counting in her head keeping time with her hands as she fought to restart a heart that had simply stopped. "Code Blue, room 314! Code Blue, room 314! The announcement echoed through the hospital corridors as Maya continued CPR, sweat already beading on her forehead despite the cool air conditioning. She'd been a nurse for 2 years at St. Catherine's, and this was exactly the kind of emergency that reminded her why she'd chosen this profession: to stand between life and death when it mattered most. The crash cart arrived first, wheeled in by Tommy Martinez from the emergency department, followed by Dr. Sarah Kim, the night resident who looked barely older than Maya's 24 years. They worked in perfect synchronization, Maya continuing compressions while Dr. Kim prepared the defibrillator, the familiar dance of emergency medicine taking over. "What's his history?" Dr. Kim asked, her hands steady as she charged the paddles. "Post-surgical pneumonia. Day 4 recovery from gallbladder removal," Maya replied between compressions, never breaking rhythm. "Vitals were stable at my last check. Blood pressure 138/85, oxygen sat 96%, temperature normal. He was sleeping peacefully when I checked on him at 3:15. "Clear!" Dr. Kim called out. Maya stepped back as electricity surged through Harold Chen's body, causing it to arch slightly before settling back into stillness. The monitor showed nothing but that terrible flat line. "Resume compressions," Dr. Kim ordered, and Maya immediately returned to her position, pressing hard and fast against the elderly man's sternum, willing his heart to respond. Minutes stretched like hours as they worked. More medications, more shocks, more desperate attempts to call Harold Chen back from wherever he'd gone. That's when Dr. Patricia Vance arrived. Maya had worked under Dr. Vance for 6 months and had never quite gotten used to the woman's intimidating presence. At 52, Patricia Vance was one of the most senior physicians at St. Catherine's, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and pale blue eyes that seemed to catalog every perceived inadequacy in the people around her. She moved through the hospital like she owned it, which, given her 25-year tenure and her reputation for never backing down from a fight, she might as well have. "Step aside, Nurse Rodriguez," Dr. Vance commanded, not bothering with pleasantries as she took Maya's place at Harold Chen's bedside. Her movements were precise and aggressive, each chest compression delivered with the kind of force that came from absolute confidence in one's abilities. "Dr. Kim, what have we tried?" As Dr. Kim rattled off the list of interventions, Maya stepped back against the wall, watching Dr. Vance work with a mixture of professional admiration and personal unease. There was something about the way Dr. Vance looked at her, not just professional assessment, but something colder, more calculating. Maya had noticed it before during their interactions, a subtle dismissiveness that made her feel like she was being evaluated and found wanting. 23 minutes after Maya had first discovered Harold Chen unresponsive, Dr. Vance straightened up and reached for the monitor's power switch. "Time of death, 4:10 a.m., she announced, her voice carrying the weight of finality that Maya had heard too many times in her short career. The room fell silent except for the soft hiss of oxygen lines and the distant sounds of the hospital continuing its never-ending work. Maya stared down at Harold Chen's peaceful face, remembering how he'd smiled at her just hours earlier when she'd helped him to the bathroom, how he'd shown her pictures of his grandchildren and talked about his plans to take them fishing once he recovered. "Nurse Rodriguez," Dr. Vance's sharp voice cut through Maya's momentary grief. "I need to speak with you about Mr. Chen's care tonight." Maya looked up, surprised by the edge in Dr. Vance's tone. "Of course, doctor. I documented everything according to protocol. His vitals were stable throughout my shift, medications administered on schedule, no signs of distress. Dr. Vance's eyes narrowed slightly. Walk me through your interactions with Mr. Chen from the beginning of your shift. Every detail. Something cold settled in Maya's stomach as she began recounting the night's events. She'd started her shift at 7 p.m., taking report from the day nurse about Harold's condition and treatment plan. His recovery had been progressing normally. No complications from surgery, pain well controlled, family visiting regularly. At 8 p.m., she'd administered his scheduled antibiotics. At 10 p.m., she'd helped him to the bathroom and encouraged him to walk a short distance to prevent blood clots. At midnight, she'd given him his pain medication, 5 milligrams of morphine, as prescribed. At 1:30 a.m., she'd checked his vitals again. At 3:15 a.m., she'd looked in on him during her rounds and found him sleeping peacefully. "And you're certain about the morphine dosage?" Dr. Vance asked, her tone deceptively casual. "Absolutely certain," Maya replied without hesitation. 5 milligrams, as ordered. I triple-checked the order, the medication, and the dosage before administration. It's standard protocol. Dr. Vance made a note in her tablet, her expression unreadable. "We'll need to review everything thoroughly, of course. Patient deaths require comprehensive investigation." Maya nodded, understanding the procedure even as something nagged at her about Dr. Remen, Vance's line of questioning. "I have all my documentation ready for review. Everything was done according to protocol." "I'm sure it was, Doctor," Vance said, but there was something in her tone that made Maya's unease deepen. "For now, why don't you complete your shift? We'll discuss this further in the morning." As Dr. Vance left the room, Maya remained with Harold Chen's body, following the post-death procedures she'd learned during her orientation. She cleaned and prepared him for the funeral home, treating his body with the same gentle care she'd shown him in life. The whole time, Dr. Vance's questions echoed in her mind. Why had she seemed so focused on the morphine? Maya had given hundreds of doses of pain medication in her 2 years as a nurse, always following the same meticulous procedure. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of routine tasks and nagging worry. Maya completed her documentation, noting every detail of Harold Chen's final hours, from his vital signs to their brief conversations. She'd learned early in nursing school that thorough documentation wasn't just a professional requirement, it was protection for both patient and nurse. As dawn broke over Chicago's skyline, painting the ICU windows with soft golden light, Maya gathered her things and prepared to leave. She'd worked 3 12-hour shifts in a row, and exhaustion weighed on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. All she wanted was to go home to her small apartment, take a hot shower, and sleep for 8 hours straight. She had no way of knowing that Harold Chen's death would be the last peaceful moment of her life for a very long time. Maya's phone buzzed insistently at 9:30 a.m., dragging her from the deep sleep she desperately needed after her string of night shifts. The caller ID showed St. Catherine's Hospital, and Maya's heart immediately began racing. Hospitals didn't call their off-duty nurses unless something was seriously wrong. "Maya Rodriguez speaking," she answered, trying to shake the grogginess from her voice. "Miss Rodriguez, this is Janet Walsh, hospital administrator. I need you to come in immediately for a meeting regarding last night's incident." Maya sat up in bed, fully awake now. Janet Walsh was a name every employee at St. Ploy, Catherine's knew, the iron-fisted administrator who'd run the hospital's business operations for the past 15 years with ruthless efficiency. She was known for her expensive suits, her perfectly manicured nails, and her ability to make nurses feel like insignificant cogs in a vast machine. "Of course, Mrs. Walsh. Should I come to your office?" "Yes. And Maya?" The use of her first name felt oddly intimate and threatening at the same time. "Bring your documentation from last night. All of it." The line went dead, leaving Maya staring at her phone with growing dread. She'd been through patient death reviews before. They were standard procedure at every hospital. But something about Janet Walsh's tone suggested this was different, more serious than the routine administrative paperwork she was expecting. Maya dressed quickly in clean scrubs and drove through Chicago's morning traffic with a knot of anxiety growing in her stomach. St. Catherine's Hospital looked different in daylight, less mysterious and urgent than it did during her night shifts, but somehow more imposing. The administrative offices were located on the 3rd floor, far from the controlled chaos of the patient care areas where Maya spent her working hours. Janet Walsh's office was exactly what Maya had expected. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, diplomas and awards covering one wall, a mahogany desk that probably cost more than Maya made in 3 months. Walsh herself was a sharp-featured woman in her mid-50s, dressed in a navy blue suit that screamed expensive, her graying hair pulled back in a style that suggested she had better things to do than worry about appearance, but somehow looked perfectly put together anyway. "Sit down, Maya," Walsh said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs positioned in front of her desk. Maya noticed that Dr. N.T. Vance was already seated in the other chair, looking composed and professional in her white coat, a tablet balanced on her lap. "I've asked Dr. Vance to join us because she was the attending physician during last night's Code Blue," Walsh continued, her tone businesslike but not unfriendly. "Yet, we need to discuss some discrepancies that have come to light regarding Mr. Chen's care." Maya's throat went dry. "Discrepancies?" Dr. Vance leaned forward slightly, her pale blue eyes fixed on Maya, with an intensity that made her want to shrink back into the leather chair. "Maya, I've spent the morning reviewing Mr. Chen's medication records, and I'm afraid there's been a serious error." "What kind of error?" Maya asked, though she was beginning to suspect where this conversation was heading. "According to the medication administration record, you signed off on giving Mr. Chen 10 milligrams of morphine at midnight," Dr. Vance said, her voice taking on the tone of a prosecutor presenting evidence. "His prescription was for 5 milligrams. That's a 100% overdose." Maya felt like someone had punched her in the stomach. "That's impossible. I gave him 5 milligrams exactly as prescribed. I triple-checked everything. The order, the medication, the dosage. I always triple-check." Dr. Vance slid a printed medication record across Walsh's desk. "Your signature is right here, Maya. Morphine sulfate, 10 milligrams, administered at 12:03 a.m. Maya stared at the paper, her hands trembling slightly as she picked it up. There was her signature, written in her characteristic loop-heavy handwriting, right next to the entry for 10 milligrams of morphine. But she knew, with absolute certainty, that she had never written those words. "I didn't write this," Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone else wrote this. Someone forged my signature." The silence in the office stretched uncomfortably long. Janet Walsh and Dr. Vance exchanged a look that Maya couldn't interpret, but it made her feel like she'd just said something incredibly naive. "Maya," Walsh said finally, her tone shifting to something that might have been intended as gentle but came across as condescending. "I understand this is difficult. Medication errors are every nurse's worst nightmare. But denial won't help anyone, least of all you." "I'm not in denial," Maya said, her voice growing stronger despite the fear clawing at her chest. "I'm telling you the truth. I did not give Harold Chen 10 milligrams of morphine. I gave him 5 milligrams, exactly as prescribed, and I documented it correctly. Someone has altered this record." Dr. Vance shook her head with what appeared to be disappointment. "Maya, I tried to give you the benefit of the doubt. You're young, you're relatively inexperienced, and last night was clearly chaotic with multiple critical patients. It would be understandable if you made a mistake under pressure." "I didn't make a mistake. The evidence suggests otherwise," Walsh interjected smoothly. "And, unfortunately, we have to consider the possibility that this medication error contributed to Mr. Chen's death." The words hit Maya like a physical blow. They were accusing her not just of a medication error, but of killing Harold Chen, the sweet old man who'd shown her pictures of his grandchildren, who'd thanked her for her gentle care, who'd been looking forward to going fishing with his family. "This is insane," Maya said, standing up abruptly, the medication record still clutched in her hands. "You're accusing me of murder based on a document that I know I didn't write?" "Sit down, Maya," Walsh commanded, her voice taking on an edge of steel. "No one is accusing you of murder, but we do have to take this situation very seriously. A patient is dead, and the evidence suggests that a medication error may have contributed to his death." "Then check the security cameras," Maya said, desperation creeping into her voice. "Check the medication room footage. Check everything. You'll see that I followed protocol exactly." "We've already begun that review, Doctor," Vance said calmly. "And I can tell you that the cameras show you entering the medication room at 11:58 p.m., which corresponds with the time on the medication record." Maya felt like the floor was dropping away beneath her feet. Of course the cameras would show her in the medication room. She'd gone there to get Harold's prescribed 5 milligrams of morphine. But somehow, that normal activity was being twisted into evidence against her. "Pending the completion of our internal investigation," Walsh continued, "you're suspended from duty, effective immediately. You'll need to surrender your badge and access cards." Maya stared at Walsh in shock. "You're suspending me? Based on what, a medication record that I know is fraudulent?" Based on a serious allegation of medication error resulting in patient death, Walsh replied coldly. This is standard procedure, Maya, for everyone's protection, including yours. The phrase, everyone's protection, felt like a slap in the face. Maya looked between Walsh and Dr. Dees, Vance, seeing the united front they presented, the way they'd clearly discussed this situation before she'd arrived. This wasn't an investigation. It was an ambush. I want to call my union representative, Maya said, trying to keep her voice steady. That's certainly your right, Walsh agreed. But the suspension takes effect immediately. Security will escort you to collect your personal items. As if summoned by magic, 2 security guards appeared in the doorway. Large, uniformed men whose presence turned Maya's suspension from an administrative action into something that felt like an arrest. Every nurse in the ICU would see her being escorted out like a criminal. Her colleagues, her friends, the patients she cared about, they'd all wonder what terrible thing Maya Rodriguez had done to warrant this kind of treatment. The walk through the hospital corridors felt like the longest journey of Maya's life. Nurses she'd worked alongside for 2 years stopped their conversations to stare as she passed, flanked by security guards like some kind of dangerous criminal. She saw the questions in their eyes, the shock and confusion, and underneath it all, the terrible suspicion that maybe, just maybe, Maya had done something unforgivable. In the locker room, Maya packed her few personal items with shaking hands, a spare pair of shoes, a jacket, the motivational quotes she'd taped to the inside of her locker door during her first week as a new graduate nurse. The security guards waited just outside, their presence a constant reminder that she was no longer trusted to be alone in the place where she'd dedicated the last 2 years of her life. As they escorted her through the main lobby, Maya caught sight of a small group of people clustered near the information desk. An elderly Asian woman was crying, while a middle-aged man in an expensive suit held her shoulders. Even from a distance, Maya could see the family resemblance to Harold Chen in their features. Harold's family was here, probably to make funeral arrangements or collect his personal effects. And here was Maya, being marched out of the hospital like a criminal, just hours after their patriarch's death. If they recognized her, if they understood what her suspension meant, the pain and confusion on their faces would be unbearable. Maya kept her eyes down and walked faster, desperate to escape the hospital before Harold Chen's grieving family could connect her face with their loss. She had no way of knowing that within hours, that connection would be made in the worst possible way. As the hospital doors closed behind her, Maya stood on the sidewalk in the bright morning sunlight, feeling more alone and frightened than she'd ever been in her life. 24 hours ago, she'd been a respected nurse with a bright future. Now she was a suspended employee, facing accusations that could destroy everything she'd worked for. And deep in her heart, she knew this was only the beginning. Maya spent the rest of that first day in a haze of disbelief and growing panic. She'd called her union representative, Linda Chen. No relation to Harold, just one of those cruel coincidences that seemed to be multiplying in her life. Linda had listened to Maya's account with professional calm, taking notes and asking pointed questions about the medication record and the suspension process. They moved very fast on this, Linda had observed. Usually there's more of an internal review process before suspension, especially for a nurse with your clean record. What does that mean? Maya had asked, though she suspected she didn't want to know the answer. It could mean they're under pressure to show they're taking decisive action. Patient death cases make hospitals nervous, especially when there's potential liability involved. The next morning brought Maya's first taste of what her life was about to become. Her phone rang at 6 a.m., jarring her from the fitful sleep that had finally claimed her around 4 a.m. Is this Maya Rodriguez? The voice was unfamiliar, professionally neutral, in a way that immediately put Maya on guard. Yes, who is this? This is Detective Mike Sullivan with the Chicago Police Department. I need to ask you some questions about Harold Chen's death at St. Catherine's Hospital. Can you come down to the station this morning? Maya felt like she'd been hit with a bucket of ice water. The police? I don't understand. Mr. Chen's family has requested an investigation into the circumstances of his death. There are allegations of negligence that we need to follow up on. Allegations? Maya's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. We can discuss this at the station, Miss Rodriguez. Say, 10 a.m.? It wasn't really a question, and Maya knew it. Should I bring a lawyer? Detective Sullivan's pause was telling. That's up to you, Ms. Rodriguez. You're not under arrest. We just need to get your statement about what happened. Maya arrived at the police station 45 minutes early, her hands shaking as she parked her 10-year-old Honda Civic between two patrol cars. The building was exactly what she'd expected from countless TV shows. Institutional beige walls, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look vaguely ill, and the underlying scent of industrial coffee and disappointment. Detective Sullivan was a thick-set man in his early 50s, with graying hair and tired eyes that suggested he'd seen more than his share of human tragedy. He led Maya to a small interview room that managed to be both claustrophobic and sterile at the same time. "Can I get you some coffee or water?" he asked, settling into the chair across from Maya with a manila folder that she assumed contained information about her case. "Water, please," Maya managed, her throat feeling like sandpaper. As Detective Sullivan poured water from a plastic pitcher into a paper cup, Maya tried to process the surreal nature of her situation. 3 days ago, she'd been a working nurse with a clean record and a bright future. Now she was sitting in a police station being questioned about a patient's death. "So, Maya, can I call you Maya? Tell me about your relationship with Harold Chen." Maya took a sip of water and tried to organize her thoughts. "He was my patient for 4 nights. Post-surgical, recovering from gallbladder removal. He was a sweet man, very polite, always thanked me for everything I did for him. And his condition during those 4 nights? Stable, normal recovery from a routine surgery. No complications, pain well controlled, family visiting regularly. He was supposed to go home in another day or 2. Detective Sullivan made notes in a small pad, his handwriting an illegible scrawl that reminded Maya uncomfortably of doctor's orders. "Walk me through that last night. Everything you remember." Maya had already gone through this timeline with Dr. Vance and Janet Walsh, but she repeated it again, trying to remember every detail. Detective Sullivan listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, his expression giving away nothing about what he was thinking. "And you're sure about the morphine dosage?" he asked when she finished. "Absolutely sure. 5 milligrams as prescribed. I've given that same dosage hundreds of times. I never make medication errors." Detective Sullivan leaned back in his chair, studying Maya with those tired eyes. "That's what they all say, sweetheart. Everyone thinks they're perfect until they make a mistake." The casual dismissal in his tone, combined with the condescending "sweetheart," sent a spike of anger through Maya's fear. "Don't call me sweetheart. And this wasn't a mistake. Someone altered that medication record after I wrote it." "Someone altered it? Who would do that?" "I don't know. But I know I didn't write what's on that record now." Detective Sullivan opened his manila folder and slid a photocopy across the small table. It was the same medication record Maya had seen in Janet Walsh's office, with her signature clearly visible next to the 10 milligram morphine entry. "That sure looks like your signature," he observed. Maya stared at the document, her frustration growing. "It's a good forgery, but it's not my handwriting. Look at the way the M is formed, the spacing between the letters. It's close, but it's not exactly the same as my other signatures on the page." Detective Sullivan glanced at the paper with what appeared to be polite interest. "I'm not a handwriting expert, Maya, but I can tell you that the hospital has provided us with comprehensive documentation of Mr. Chen's care, including pharmacy records showing that you checked out 10 milligrams of morphine at 11:58 p.m. Maya felt her heart sink. "That's impossible. I only checked out 5 milligrams. The computer records don't lie, sweetheart." There was that word again, dripping with condescension. "And we have security footage of you entering the medication room at that exact time." "Of course I entered the medication room. I needed to get Mr. Chen's pain medication. But I only took 5 milligrams, not 10. Detective Sullivan closed the folder with a soft thud. "Here's the thing, Maya. An elderly man is dead, and the evidence suggests that a medication error contributed to his death. His son is a lawyer, and he's pushing hard for someone to be held accountable." "His son?" "David Chen. He's pretty upset about his father's death, as you might imagine. He seems to think that careless nursing care killed the old man." Maya remembered the man in the expensive suit she'd seen in the hospital lobby, the way he'd held his grieving mother. Now that grief had transformed into something directed at her, a demand for justice that painted her as the villain in Harold Chen's story. "I didn't kill anyone," Maya said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Harold Chen died of natural causes. His heart stopped. It happens sometimes, especially with elderly patients recovering from surgery. Maybe, but a morphine overdose can cause respiratory depression, which can lead to cardiac arrest. That's what the medical examiner is going to be looking for when he does the autopsy." The word autopsy sent a chill through Maya. Harold Chen's body would be cut open, examined, tested, all to determine whether she had killed him. The sweet old man who'd shown her pictures of his grandchildren would become evidence in a case that could destroy her life. "I want to see the security footage," Maya said. "If you have cameras showing me in the medication room, Then those same cameras should show exactly what I took from the medication cabinet. Detective Sullivan shrugged. That's not really up to me. The hospital controls their security system. Then I want to talk to someone who can access those cameras. I want to see proof of what I supposedly did. Maya. Detective Sullivan's tone shifted slightly, becoming almost paternal. Let me give you some advice. You're young, you made a mistake under pressure, and an old man died because of it. That's tragic, but it's not necessarily criminal. If you cooperate with this investigation, if you show some remorse for what happened, the district attorney might be willing to consider a lesser charge. A lesser charge? Maya felt like she was drowning. You're talking about criminal charges? Involuntary manslaughter, most likely. With your clean record and the circumstances, you might be looking at probation, maybe some community service. But if you keep denying responsibility, if you force the family to go through a trial, the consequences could be a lot more severe. Maya stared at Detective Sullivan in disbelief. He was offering her a plea deal for a crime she hadn't committed, suggesting that admitting to killing Harold Chen might be her best option. The logic was insane, but she could see the practical reality behind it. The evidence against her looked overwhelming, even though she knew it was fabricated. A jury might look at the documentation, the pharmacy records, the security footage showing her in the medication room, and conclude that Maya Rodriguez was a careless nurse who'd killed an elderly patient. I need to talk to a lawyer, Maya said. That's your right, Detective Sullivan agreed, standing up and extending his hand. But don't take too long to decide what you want to do, Maya. The longer this drags out, the worse it gets for everyone involved. Maya left the police station feeling like she'd aged 10 years in the span of 2 hours. The morning sun felt too bright, the traffic noise too loud, everything around her sharp and overwhelming in a way that suggested her world had fundamentally changed. She was no longer just a suspended nurse facing an internal investigation. She was a suspect in a criminal case, a young woman whose freedom and future hung on evidence she couldn't explain and accusations she couldn't refute. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her mother. Mija, saw the news about the hospital. Are you okay? Maya stared at the message, her blood running cold. The news? She quickly opened her browser and searched for St. Catherine's Hospital and patient death. The headline hit her like a physical blow. Nurse suspended after patient death at St. Catherine's Hospital. The article was brief but devastating, reporting that a young nurse had been suspended pending investigation into a medication error that may have contributed to an elderly patient's death. Maya's name wasn't mentioned, but anyone who knew her would be able to connect the dots. By the time she got home, Maya had 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. Word was spreading through her network of friends, family, and colleagues like wildfire. Everyone wanted to know what had happened, whether the news reports were true, whether Maya was okay. But the question that haunted her most was one that no one was asking yet, but that she knew would come soon. Was Maya Rodriguez the kind of nurse who could kill a patient through carelessness or incompetence? And as the accusations mounted and the evidence against her seemed to solidify, Maya was beginning to wonder if anyone would believe her when she insisted that the answer was no. Maya's life unraveled with stunning speed over the next 2 weeks. What had started as a hospital suspension quickly metastasized into something that infected every aspect of her existence, spreading through her world like a malignant tumor that consumed everything in its path. The first devastating blow came from the Chicago District Attorney's Office. Maya had been expecting the call, dreading it since her conversation with Detective Sullivan, but the reality was still a gut punch that left her gasping for breath. Ms. Rodriguez, this is Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh. The voice was crisp, professional, utterly impersonal. I'm calling to inform you that our office will be filing formal charges in the death of Harold Chen. Maya's hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped the phone. What charges? Involuntary manslaughter and reckless endangerment. The charges will be filed tomorrow morning, and a warrant will be issued for your arrest. Arrest? Maya's voice came out as a strangled whisper. You can surrender yourself at the district attorney's office tomorrow at 9 a.m., or the police will come to find you. I'd recommend the former option. After the call ended, Maya sat on her couch staring at the phone for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Involuntary manslaughter. The words echoed in her head, impossible to fully comprehend. In less than 3 weeks, she'd gone from being a respected nurse to facing charges that could send her to prison for years. The lawyer her union representative had found for her was Robert Kim, a public defender with an overwhelming caseload and the harried appearance of someone who was perpetually behind on everything. They met in a cramped office that smelled of stale coffee and disappointment, surrounded by towers of case files that threatened to topple over at any moment. "I've reviewed the evidence," Kim said, flipping through a manila folder that contained what remained of Maya's future. "I have to be honest with you, Maya. This is not a strong case for the defense." "But I didn't do anything wrong," Maya protested, hearing the desperation in her own voice. "The problem is the evidence suggests otherwise," Kim replied, pulling out photocopies of the same documents Maya had seen before. "Hospital records show you administered a double dose of morphine. Pharmacy records confirm you checked out that amount. Security cameras show you in the medication room at the right time, and Harold Chen died shortly after receiving that medication. Someone forged the hospital records. Someone else used my badge to access the medications. Why won't anyone investigate that possibility?" Kim gave her a look that was probably meant to be sympathetic, but came across as tired resignation. "Maya, I understand this is difficult to accept, but claiming a conspiracy at one of Chicago's most respected hospitals, that's not going to play well with a jury. So, what are you suggesting?" "The DA has offered a plea agreement. You plead guilty to involuntary manslaughter, accept responsibility for Mr. Cleaterdos, Chen's death, and they recommend 18 months in minimum security prison, with the possibility of parole in 9 months. Maya stared at Kim in disbelief. "You want me to admit to killing someone I didn't kill? I want you to consider your options realistically. If this goes to trial and you're convicted, you could face up to 4 years in prison. The evidence against you is substantial, Maya. A jury is going to see a young, inexperienced nurse who made a fatal mistake and then refused to take responsibility for it." That phrase, "refused to take responsibility," would haunt Maya for weeks. It implied that owning up to Harold Chen's death was somehow the moral thing to do, that her insistence on her innocence was a character flaw rather than a desperate attempt to tell the truth. The arrest itself was a humiliation Maya would never forget. Despite surrendering herself voluntarily, she was still handcuffed, fingerprinted, and photographed like any other criminal. The booking process reduced her to a number and a series of identifying characteristics. Maya Rodriguez, female Hispanic, 24 years old, 5'4", 130 pounds, charged with involuntary manslaughter. The local news picked up the story immediately. "Nurse charged in patient death," ran on the evening news, complete with Maya's booking photo and footage of her leaving the courthouse after her arraignment. The reporter, a perfectly groomed woman who probably had never set foot in a hospital except as a patient, spoke gravely about a tragic case that highlights the importance of medication safety in healthcare settings. Maya's phone exploded with notifications as the story spread across social media. Most of the comments were predictably harsh. "Another careless millennial nurse. She looks guilty. How do you accidentally give someone twice the prescribed dose? This is why I don't trust young nurses." The few supportive comments were drowned out by waves of condemnation from people who knew nothing about Maya except what they'd seen on the news. She was becoming a symbol, a cautionary tale about incompetence and the dangers of trusting inexperienced healthcare workers with vulnerable patients. The impact on Maya's family was devastating to watch. Her mother, Isabella Rodriguez, had worked as a home health aide for 15 years and had always been proud of her daughter's education and professional success. Now she called Maya every day, crying, asking questions Maya couldn't answer. "Mija, I don't understand. How could this happen? You were always so careful, so dedicated to your patients." "I am careful, Mama. I didn't do what they're saying I did. But why would they arrest you if you didn't do anything wrong?" It was a question Maya couldn't answer, because she was beginning to doubt her own understanding of how justice was supposed to work. If she was innocent, why did all the evidence point to her guilt? If she hadn't made the medication error, why did the hospital records clearly show that she had? Maya's father, Roberto Rodriguez, had worked as a janitor at different Chicago hospitals for 30 years. He understood hospital politics and the way institutions protected themselves better than anyone in the family. "Something is not right here," he told Maya during one of their difficult conversations. "In 30 years, I've seen nurses make mistakes, real mistakes. The hospitals don't usually call the police unless there's something else going on." "What do you mean?" Roberto's weathered face was grim with understanding that came from decades of watching powerful people make decisions that affected the powerless. Sometimes when hospitals get in trouble, they need someone to blame, someone who can't fight back. It was the first time anyone had suggested that Maya might be a scapegoat rather than a perpetrator, and the possibility both terrified and relieved her. If her father was right, then her innocence was irrelevant. She was being sacrificed to protect something or someone more important than a 24-year-old nurse from a working-class family. The professional consequences mounted daily. The Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation began proceedings to revoke Maya's nursing license. The letter was clinical and devastating. Based on allegations of professional misconduct resulting in patient death, your license to practice nursing in the state of Illinois is subject to emergency suspension. Without her license, Maya couldn't work as a nurse anywhere in the country. The career she'd trained for, the profession she'd chosen as her life's work, was being stripped away before she'd even been convicted of anything. The system was treating her as guilty until proven innocent, despite all the constitutional principles that were supposed to protect her. Even worse was the response from her former colleagues. Maya had expected support from the nurses she'd worked alongside for 2 years, people who knew her work ethic and her dedication to patient care. Instead, she found herself isolated and abandoned. Some of her former coworkers simply stopped responding to her calls and texts, creating a silence that spoke volumes about their discomfort with being associated with her situation. Others were more direct in their rejection. "Maya, I'm sorry, but I can't be seen supporting someone charged with what you're charged with," one former friend explained during a painful phone conversation. "I have my own career to think about." The betrayal that hurt most came from Jake Morrison, her boyfriend of 8 months. Jake was a physical therapist at a different hospital, someone Maya had thought understood the pressures and challenges of healthcare work. She'd expected him to be her strongest supporter, the person who would stand by her through this nightmare. Instead, Jake became increasingly distant as the charges mounted and the media attention intensified. Their conversations became stilted, filled with awkward pauses and unspoken doubts. "Maybe you just made a mistake under pressure," he said during what would be their last dinner together. "It doesn't make you a bad person, Maya. Everyone makes mistakes." "I didn't make a mistake," Maya replied, feeling like she was screaming into a void. "I did everything right. Someone else is responsible for Harold Chen's death." Jake looked uncomfortable, shifting in his chair like he wanted to be anywhere else. "The evidence is pretty convincing, Maya. Maybe if you just accepted responsibility, showed some remorse, the whole thing would go away." "Accept responsibility for something I didn't do? Admit to killing an innocent man? I'm just saying, sometimes fighting makes things worse. Maybe you should take the plea deal your lawyer mentioned." That's when Maya realized that even Jake, the person who claimed to love her, didn't believe in her innocence. He was willing to accept that she'd killed Harold Chen through carelessness or incompetence, and his advice was for her to admit to it and move on with her life. "Get out," Maya said quietly. "Maya, come on. I'm just trying to help. Get out of my apartment. Get out of my life. If you think I'm capable of killing a patient and then lying about it, then you don't know me at all." Jake left, and with him went Maya's last connection to the life she'd built before Harold Chen's death. She was now completely alone, facing criminal charges, financial ruin, and the collapse of everything she'd worked for. The financial pressure was becoming unbearable. Without her nursing salary, Maya couldn't afford her apartment rent, her car payment, or even basic groceries. Her savings, accumulated over 2 years of careful budgeting, were rapidly depleted by legal fees and living expenses. She took a job at a fast food restaurant, hiding her identity as much as possible, and praying that none of her coworkers would recognize her from the news coverage. The work was humiliating after years as a professional nurse, but it was the only employment she could find that didn't require background checks or professional references. Even that small refuge was temporary. After 3 weeks, a coworker approached her during her break with a smartphone in hand. "Aren't you that nurse? The one who killed the old man?" Maya's heart sank as she realized her secret was out. "I didn't kill anyone." "Yeah, that's what they all say. Man, working with a murderer. That's messed up." By the end of the week, Maya's manager called her into the office. "I'm sorry, Maya, but some customers have complained about you being here. It's creating a distraction. I'm going to have to let you go." Another door closed, another piece of Maya's life stripped away. She was becoming unemployable, a pariah whose presence made others uncomfortable and whose association brought unwanted attention to businesses and organizations. The eviction notice came on a Thursday. Maya's landlord, Mrs. Patterson, had always been friendly before, often asking about Maya's work at the hospital and expressing pride in having a nurse as a tenant. Now she avoided eye contact as she explained the situation. "I'm sorry, Maya, but the other tenants are uncomfortable. There have been complaints about reporters calling and people asking questions about you. It's disruptive to the building." Maya packed her belongings into her Honda Civic and drove to her parents' house in a working-class neighborhood on Chicago's South Side. At 24 years old, with a college degree and 2 years of professional experience, she was moving back into her childhood bedroom, unemployed and facing criminal charges that could send her to prison. Her parents welcomed her with love and support, but Maya could see the strain in their faces, the worry that aged them visibly as the case progressed. They were good people who had worked hard their entire lives, paid their taxes, followed the rules, and believed that the system would treat them fairly. Maya's situation challenged everything they'd believed about justice and fairness in America. As Maya lay in her narrow childhood bed, surrounded by faded posters and high school trophies, she stared at the ceiling and wondered how her life had disintegrated so completely. 3 months ago, she'd been a successful nurse with a bright future, a loving relationship, and the respect of her colleagues. Now she was a criminal defendant with no career, no income, no support system, and no hope for vindication. The worst part was the growing doubt that gnawed at her in the dark hours of the night. Everyone, the police, the prosecutors, the hospital administrators, her former colleagues, even her own boyfriend, seemed convinced of her guilt. The evidence against her was overwhelming, documented in official records that seemed impossible to forge. Was it possible that she'd made a mistake and blocked it from her memory? Could she have been so stressed and overwhelmed that night that she'd given the wrong dose and then convinced herself that she'd followed protocol? Was her insistence on innocence just a psychological defense mechanism to protect her from accepting a devastating truth about herself? But then Maya would remember Harold Chen's face, the way he'd smiled at her when she'd helped him to the bathroom, the pictures of his grandchildren that he'd shown her with such pride. She would remember her meticulous approach to medication administration, the triple-checking process that had become second nature after 2 years of nursing practice. No matter how much doubt crept into her mind, Maya knew with absolute certainty that she had not given Harold Chen 10 milligrams of morphine. Someone else was responsible for his death, and that same person was allowing her to take the blame for their actions. The question that haunted her was whether she would ever be able to prove it. Dr. James Morrison arrived at St. Catherine's Hospital on a gray Monday morning in October, carrying a box of personal items and the weight of expectations that came with being named Chief of Medicine. At 55, Morrison had built a reputation as a physician who valued integrity above politics, patient care above profit margins, and truth above convenience. His appointment had surprised many at St. Catherine's who were used to leadership that prioritized smooth operations over uncomfortable questions. Morrison's first week was consumed with the routine tasks of transition, budget reviews, staff meetings, policy discussions, and the endless stream of administrative responsibilities that came with running a major hospital department. But it was during his second week, while reviewing recent mortality cases as part of his orientation, that Harold Chen's file crossed his desk. The case was supposed to be closed, a tragic but straightforward medication error that had resulted in appropriate disciplinary action and criminal charges. Maya Rodriguez had been suspended, arrested, and charged with involuntary manslaughter. The hospital's lawyers had prepared their defense strategy, focusing on the prompt action taken to address the nurse's negligence. From an administrative perspective, the case was handled. But something about the file bothered Morrison. He couldn't quite identify what it was. Some inconsistency that nagged at the edges of his consciousness, like a partially remembered dream. He found himself returning to Harold Chen's chart repeatedly, reading through the documentation with the careful attention he'd once applied to differential diagnoses in complex medical cases. Maya Rodriguez's personnel file only deepened his unease. Her 2-year record at St. Catherine's was exemplary. Consistently high performance evaluations, commendations from patients and families, 0 medication errors or disciplinary actions. Her nursing school transcripts showed a student who graduated near the top of her class with particular strength in pharmacology and patient safety protocols. This doesn't fit the profile, Morrison muttered to himself, comparing Maya's sterling record with the catastrophic medication error she was accused of committing. In his 30 years of medicine, Morrison had seen plenty of healthcare workers make mistakes. There were usually warning signs, previous errors, performance issues, personal problems that affected job performance. Maya Rodriguez had none of those red flags. Morrison decided to speak with some of the nurses who had worked with Maya, starting with Carol Martinez, the ICU supervisor who had been Maya's immediate boss. "Dr. Morrison, I'm glad you're looking into this," Carol said when they met in her small office adjacent to the ICU. She was a veteran nurse with 23 years of experience, and Morrison could see the genuine distress in her eyes as they discussed Maya's case. "What's your assessment of Maya Rodriguez as a nurse?" Carol was quiet for a long moment, clearly choosing her words carefully. "Maya was one of the best nurses I've supervised in my 15 years as a manager. Meticulous, compassionate, always went the extra mile for her patients. The idea that she would make a medication error, especially one that serious, it just doesn't fit with the Maya I knew. But you think she did it? I don't know what to think, Carol admitted. The evidence seems clear. But I've been wondering about something. The timeline that night doesn't quite make sense. Morrison leaned forward, interested. How so? Maya was assigned to 4 patients that night. At the time she supposedly gave Mr. Chen the wrong dose of morphine, I know for certain she was in room 302 with Mrs. Patterson, who was having a difficult time with post-surgical nausea. I remember because I helped her with the anti-nausea medication. Are you sure about the timing? Positive. Mrs. Patterson was scheduled for medication at midnight, and Maya was very conscientious about staying on schedule. She would have been preparing that medication at 11:58, not dispensing morphine to Mr. Chen. Morrison made a note to check the medication records for room 302. Did you share this information with the investigators? Carol's expression became uncomfortable. I mentioned it to Dr. Vance when she was conducting her review. She said the timestamps might be off, that Maya could have handled both patients quickly. And you accepted that explanation? I wanted to. Dr. Vance has been here a lot longer than me, and she seemed very sure about what had happened. But it's been bothering me ever since. Morrison's next stop was the hospital's IT department, where he requested access to all security footage from the ICU during Maya's last shift. The IT director, a nervous man named Peter Walsh, who was coincidentally related to the hospital administrator, seemed reluctant to provide comprehensive access. Dr. Vance already reviewed the relevant footage, Walsh explained. She identified all the pertinent sequences related to the incident. I'd like to see everything, Morrison said firmly. Complete footage from all cameras, the entire shift. That's a lot of data, Dr. Morrison. Some of the older footage might be corrupted or difficult to access. Morrison had been an administrator long enough to recognize stalling tactics when he encountered them. Mr. Walsh, I'm not asking for your opinion on what's relevant. I'm directing you, as Chief of Medicine, to provide me with complete access to the security footage. Is that going to be a problem? The footage review took Morrison most of his weekend. He set up in his office with multiple monitors, methodically going through 12 hours of security camera recordings from different angles throughout the ICU. It was tedious work, but Morrison had always been patient when searching for answers to complex problems. The breakthrough came at 2:47 a.m. on Sunday morning, as Morrison reviewed footage from the medication room for the 20th time. At 11:58 p.m. on the night Harold Chen died, the cameras clearly showed Maya Rodriguez entering room 302, not the medication room. She was carrying medication that had obviously been prepared earlier, consistent with her routine practice of preparing multiple patients' medications during her scheduled rounds. But at that same timestamp, 11:58 p.m., someone else was entering the medication room. The figure was wearing scrubs and a surgical mask, making identification difficult, but something about the person's height and build looked familiar to Morrison. He rewound the footage and enhanced the image as much as the system allowed. The person entering the medication room moved with confidence, someone who clearly belonged in that space. Morrison watched as the figure approached the controlled substance cabinet and used what appeared to be a key card to gain access. Morrison fast-forwarded through the footage, tracking the mystery person's movements. At 12:03 a.m., the figure exited the medication room carrying a small vial, presumably the morphine that would later be found in Harold Chen's system. The person moved through the ICU corridors with purpose, heading toward the patient rooms. But instead of going to Harold Chen's room, the figure entered the staff break room and remained there for several minutes. Morrison enhanced the timestamp and made careful notes. Whatever had happened to Harold Chen, it wasn't a simple medication error by an inexperienced nurse. Morrison's pulse quickened as he continued following the mysterious figure through the security footage. At 12:15 a.m., the person emerged from the break room and walked directly to Harold Chen's room. The camera angle didn't allow Morrison to see exactly what happened inside, but the person remained in the room for approximately 4 minutes before emerging and returning to the staff areas. The really disturbing discovery came when Morrison tracked the figure's exit from the medication room at 11:58 p.m. As the person passed under a better positioned camera, Morrison could make out more details despite the surgical mask. The height, the posture, the confident stride, it all seemed familiar. Morrison spent another hour going through footage from different angles, trying to get a clearer view of the mystery person's face. Finally, at 12:47 a.m., as the figure passed through the main ICU corridor, the surgical mask had slipped slightly, revealing enough of the person's profile for Morrison to make a positive identification. Dr. Patricia Vance. Morrison sat back in his chair, feeling like he'd been punched in the stomach. The senior physician, who had led the investigation into Maya Rodriguez's alleged medication error, had herself been in the medication room at the critical time. Moreover, Vance had been in Harold Chen's room shortly after midnight, during the window when the fatal dose of morphine had supposedly been administered. The implications were staggering. If Dr. D test any two, Vance had been the one to access the controlled substances and enter Harold Chen's room. Then Maya Rodriguez was not only innocent, but had been deliberately framed for a crime she didn't commit. Morrison's hands were shaking as he made copies of the relevant footage segments. He needed more evidence before he could act on what he'd discovered. But the security cameras had provided him with something that no amount of falsified paperwork could explain away. Visual proof that the official timeline of Harold Chen's death was completely wrong. His next step was to examine the medication dispensing records more carefully. Morrison had enough administrative access to review pharmacy logs, and he wanted to see exactly how the morphine had been checked out on the night Harold Chen died. The pharmacy records showed that 10 milligrams of morphine had been dispensed at 11:58 p.m., using Maya Rodriguez's badge and access code. But Morrison now knew that Maya had been in room 302 at that time, not in the medication room. Someone else had used her credentials to access the controlled substances. Morrison examined Maya's badge access logs for the entire shift. There were multiple entries showing her badge being used throughout the night, but several of them corresponded to times when the security cameras showed Maya in different locations. Her badge had been cloned or stolen, allowing someone else to use her identity for accessing medications and creating a false electronic trail. The evidence was starting to paint a picture of elaborate premeditation rather than a simple medication error. Harold Chen hadn't died because a young nurse made a mistake under pressure. He had died because someone had deliberately given him a fatal dose of morphine and then orchestrated an intricate cover-up that blamed Maya Rodriguez for the crime. But why would Dr. Patricia Vance kill Harold Chen? And why would she destroy Maya's life to cover up her actions? Morrison spent the next day researching Dr. Vance's background, looking for any information that might explain her motive. What he found was disturbing. Over the past 5 years, there had been 3 other patient deaths in cases where Dr. Vance had been the attending physician. All 3 cases had been closed without significant investigation, attributed to complications of surgery or underlying medical conditions. Morrison also discovered that Harold Chen's family had been preparing to file a malpractice lawsuit against St. Catherine's Hospital for a different issue entirely, a surgical error during Harold's gallbladder removal that had been covered up by the medical staff. Harold had developed an infection because of contaminated surgical equipment, an infection that had been misdiagnosed and inadequately treated. The malpractice suit would have exposed systemic problems at St. Catherine's and potentially cost the hospital millions of dollars in damages and regulatory fines. It would have also focused attention on Dr. Perperlians and from Herdzand Vance, who had been the supervising physician for the original surgery. Harold Chen's death had effectively ended the malpractice case. Grieving families rarely pursue lawsuits when they believe their loved one died because of nursing negligence rather than physician error. By framing Maya Rodriguez for Harold's death, Dr. Vance had not only covered up her own culpability, but had also protected the hospital from devastating legal and financial consequences. Morrison realized he was looking at something far more sinister than a medication error. Dr. Patricia Vance had committed murder to protect herself and the hospital from a malpractice lawsuit, and she had systematically destroyed Maya Rodriguez's life to ensure that her crime would never be discovered. The young nurse sitting in jail, facing years in prison for a crime she didn't commit, was the victim of one of the most elaborate and heartless cover-ups Morrison had ever encountered. Maya Rodriguez hadn't just been wrongly accused. She had been deliberately selected as a scapegoat by someone who had calculated that a young, inexperienced nurse from a working-class family would be powerless to defend herself against institutional corruption. As Morrison sat in his office, surrounded by evidence of Dr. Vance's crimes, he faced a decision that would define the rest of his career. He could bring this information to the authorities and destroy Dr. Vance's life while vindicating Maya Rodriguez. Or he could find some way to handle the situation quietly, protecting the hospital's reputation while somehow helping Maya without admitting the institution's role in the cover-up. For Morrison, who had spent his entire career believing that medicine was a profession built on truth and integrity, there was really no choice at all. It was time to make some phone calls. Dr. Morrison's first call was to Janet Walsh, the hospital administrator whose polished exterior and political instincts had made her a fixture at St. Catherine's for 15 years. Morrison had worked with administrators like Walsh before, people who measured success in budget numbers and liability reduction rather than patient outcomes or staff welfare. "Janet, I need to see you immediately," Morrison said when Walsh's secretary put him through. "It's about the Harold Chen case." "I thought that matter was resolved, James. The nurse has been charged, and our legal team is confident in our position." "The matter is far from resolved. I have evidence that Maya Rodriguez is innocent, and that we've been covering up a crime." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Walsh spoke again, her voice had taken on the carefully controlled tone that Morrison recognized as her crisis management mode. "This is a serious allegation, James. I think we should discuss this in person, with our legal counsel present." "Fine. But I want this meeting to happen today." The meeting took place in Walsh's spacious office 3 hours later. In addition to Walsh, the room included the hospital's chief legal counsel, Richard Stone, a sharp-featured man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd stepped out of a corporate law firm rather than a hospital administration office. Morrison had spent the intervening time preparing his presentation, organizing the security footage, medication records, and timeline documentation that proved Maya Rodriguez's innocence and implicated Dr. Patricia Vance in Harold Chen's murder. "Before we begin," Stone said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling conversations, "I want to make it clear that this discussion is covered by attorney-client privilege. Nothing said in this room can be disclosed outside of this meeting without the hospital's consent." Morrison had expected this legal maneuvering, but it still irritated him. "I'm not here as your client, Richard. I'm here as chief of medicine reporting a crime that's been covered up by this institution." "You're an employee of this hospital," Stone replied smoothly. "Your findings in the course of your employment are covered by privilege whether you like it or not." Morrison ignored the implicit threat and began presenting his evidence. He showed them the security footage of Dr. Vance entering the medication room at 11:58 p.m., the same timestamp when Maya Rodriguez was documented as being in a different location. He explained the discrepancies in the badge access logs, the evidence that Maya's credentials had been used by someone else to access controlled substances. Walsh and Stone watched the footage in silence, their expressions revealing nothing about their thoughts. When Morrison finished his presentation, the room remained quiet for nearly a minute. "This is very serious, James," Walsh said finally. "If what you're suggesting is true, then we have a significant problem." "We have a young woman facing prison for a crime she didn't commit," Morrison replied. "That's more than a significant problem. It's a moral catastrophe." Stone leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him like a prosecutor, preparing to cross-examine a witness. "Dr. Morrison, you've presented some interesting footage, but interpretation of security cameras can be subjective. Dr. Vance's presence in the medication room doesn't necessarily prove that she was responsible for Mr. Chen's death." "The timeline proves it," Morrison said, his frustration growing. "Maya Rodriguez was in room 302 when the morphine was accessed. Dr. Vance was in the medication room. Dr. WWWW. Vance was in Harold Chen's room during the critical time period. The evidence is overwhelming. Evidence that would destroy this hospital's reputation and expose us to massive liability," Walsh interjected. "James, I understand your concern for Miss Rodriguez, but we have to consider the broader implications of what you're suggesting." Morrison stared at Walsh in disbelief. "You're worried about the hospital's reputation? A woman is facing prison for a crime she didn't commit, and you're concerned about bad publicity?" "I'm concerned about the thousands of employees whose jobs depend on this hospital's continued operation," Walsh replied, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "I'm concerned about the patients who rely on our services, the community programs we fund, the medical research we support. This institution serves purposes much larger than any individual case. Even when that individual case involves covering up murder and destroying an innocent woman's life?" Stone held up a hand, signaling for calm. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves with inflammatory language. What we have here is a complex situation that requires careful handling. There may be ways to address Ms. Rodriguez's situation without necessarily pursuing the more dramatic conclusions you've drawn." Morrison understood what Stone was suggesting, some kind of quiet resolution that would help Maya while protecting the hospital and Dr. Vance from the consequences of their actions. A sealed settlement, perhaps, with Maya agreeing never to discuss the case in exchange for having the charges dropped and receiving financial compensation. "You want to buy her silence," Morrison said. "I want to find a solution that serves everyone's interests," Stone replied. Ms. Rodriguez gets her life back, the hospital avoids devastating publicity, and we can all move forward. What about Dr. Vance? What about the fact that she committed murder? Walsh and Stone exchanged a look that told Morrison they'd already discussed this possibility. Dr. Vance has been a valued member of our medical staff for 25 years, Walsh said. She's scheduled to retire next year anyway. Perhaps we can accelerate that timeline. Morrison felt sick to his stomach. They were proposing to let a murderer retire quietly while the woman she'd framed struggled to rebuild her shattered life. It was institutional corruption at its most cynical, protecting the powerful while sacrificing the powerless, maintaining the status quo regardless of the human cost. This is unconscionable, Morrison said, standing up from his chair. You're talking about covering up a crime to protect the hospital's image. I'm talking about finding a practical solution to a complex problem, Walsh replied. Dr. Morrison, you're new here, but you need to understand how things work. Sometimes the greater good requires difficult compromises. The greater good requires justice. It requires truth. It requires protecting innocent people from being destroyed by institutional corruption. Stone's expression hardened. Dr. Morrison, I want to make sure you understand your position here. You're an employee of this hospital, subject to the terms of your contract and the policies of this institution. If you were to take action that damages the hospital's interests, there could be serious consequences for your employment. The threat was delivered with lawyer's precision, carefully worded but unmistakably clear. Morrison was being told that pursuing justice for Maya Rodriguez would cost him his job and potentially his career. Are you threatening me, Richard? I'm explaining the reality of your situation. You have responsibilities to this institution that go beyond any individual case. Morrison looked around the room, at Walsh with her calculating eyes, at Stone with his corporate lawyer's mentality, at the institutional machinery that was designed to protect itself above all else. He'd walked into this meeting hoping to convince them to do the right thing, to support him in bringing the truth about Maya Rodriguez's case to light. Instead, he discovered that the corruption went far deeper than Dr. Vance's individual actions. The entire hospital administration was complicit in the cover-up, willing to sacrifice Maya's freedom and future to protect their own interests. I need some time to consider all of this, Morrison said, gathering his materials. Of course, Walsh replied, her tone suggesting that she considered the matter settled. But James, I hope you'll think carefully about the consequences of any precipitous actions. This hospital has been good to you, and I'd hate to see your career here end badly. Morrison left the meeting with a sick feeling in his stomach and a clear understanding of what he was up against. The institutional forces arrayed against Maya Rodriguez weren't limited to one corrupt physician. They included the hospital's entire leadership structure, people who were willing to let an innocent woman go to prison rather than admit their own culpability and face the consequences of their actions. But Morrison had not taken the job at St. Catherine's to be another cog in a corrupt machine. He'd accepted the position because he believed he could make a difference, could bring integrity and transparency to an institution that served some of Chicago's most vulnerable populations. Maya Rodriguez deserved better than a quiet settlement that bought her freedom while leaving her reputation in ruins. Harold Chen's family deserved to know the truth about how their patriarch had died. The patients at St. Catherine's deserved to be protected from healthcare providers who put institutional interests above patient safety. Morrison returned to his office and made 2 phone calls. The first was to Maya Rodriguez. Ms. Rodriguez, this is Dr. James Morrison, the chief of medicine at St. Catherine's Hospital. I believe you're innocent of the charges against you, and I have evidence that will clear your name. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Morrison wondered if the connection had been broken. When Maya finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Who is this? Is this some kind of joke? It's not a joke, Miss Rodriguez. I've been reviewing your case, and I've discovered evidence that proves you didn't administer the morphine that killed Harold Chen. Someone else used your credentials to access the medication and enter his room. Why should I believe you? Everyone else has lied to me. Morrison understood her suspicion. After months of betrayal and false accusations, Maya had every reason to be wary of anyone claiming to help her. Because I have security footage that shows exactly what happened that night. Footage that proves you were in room 302 when the morphine was being accessed from the medication room. Footage that shows who really killed Harold Chen. Morrison heard what sounded like a sharp intake of breath, followed by something that might have been crying. Are you saying I'm not crazy? That I didn't imagine this whole thing? You're not crazy, Ms. Rodriguez. You're the victim of an elaborate frame-up designed to cover up a murder. But I'm going to help you prove your innocence. Morrison's second phone call was to Detective Mike Sullivan, the Chicago police investigator who had handled Maya's case with such casual dismissiveness. "Detective Sullivan, this is Dr. James Morrison at St. Catherine's Hospital. I have new evidence in the Harold Chen murder case that proves Maya Rodriguez is innocent." "Dr. Morrison, that case is closed. The nurse was charged based on overwhelming evidence. The evidence was fabricated. I have security footage that shows Dr. Patricia Vance accessing controlled substances using Maya Rodriguez's stolen credentials. I have proof that Dr. Vance was in Harold Chen's room during the time the fatal dose was administered." Sullivan's tone shifted from dismissive to interested. "That's a serious allegation, Dr. Morrison. You're talking about accusing a senior physician of murder and evidence tampering. I'm not just alleging it. I can prove it. Can we meet to discuss this evidence?" "Yeah," Sullivan said after a pause. "I think we better." As Morrison hung up the phone, he realized that he'd just declared war on his own employer. The hospital administration would view his actions as betrayal, a violation of institutional loyalty that could destroy his career. Dr. Patricia Vance would fight back with all the resources and influence she'd accumulated over 25 years in medicine. But sometimes, Morrison reflected, the right thing to do was also the dangerous thing to do. Maya Rodriguez had already paid a terrible price for other people's crimes. It was time for the real perpetrators to face the consequences of their actions. Morrison spent the rest of the day preparing for what he knew would be the most important fight of his professional life. He made copies of all the evidence, stored them in multiple secure locations, and began planning his strategy for taking down the conspiracy that had destroyed Maya Rodriguez's life. The truth was finally going to come out, regardless of who it destroyed in the process. Detective Sullivan had initially been skeptical when Dr. Morrison called about new evidence in the Harold Chen case. Maya Rodriguez's conviction had seemed like a slam dunk, clear documentation, pharmacy records, security footage placing her at the scene. It was the kind of case prosecutors loved and defense attorneys dreaded. But as Sullivan sat in Morrison's office 2 days later, watching enhanced security footage on multiple monitors, his certainty began to crumble. The timeline that had seemed so clear-cut 3 months ago was revealed as an elaborate fabrication built on stolen credentials and manipulated records. "Jesus," Sullivan muttered as Morrison replayed the footage, showing Dr. Vance entering the medication room at 11:58 p.m. "How did we miss this?" "Because you were only shown selected footage," Morrison replied, his voice carrying an edge of controlled anger. Dr. Vance conducted the initial review of the security cameras, and she only provided clips that supported the narrative she was constructing. Sullivan made notes as Morrison walked him through the evidence. The badge access logs showing Maya Rodriguez's credentials being used while she was documented in different locations, the pharmacy records that proved someone else had checked out the fatal dose of morphine, the timeline that placed Dr. Vance in Harold Chen's room during the critical window. "What's her motive?" Sullivan asked. "Why would Dr. Vance kill Harold Chen?" Morrison handed Sullivan a folder containing information about the pending malpractice lawsuit that Harold Chen's family had been preparing. Mr. Chen was going to sue the hospital for surgical complications that were covered up by the medical staff. Dr. Vance was the supervising physician for the surgery where the complications occurred. So she killed him to prevent a lawsuit? She killed him to prevent an investigation that would have exposed systemic problems at the hospital and destroyed her career. The malpractice case would have revealed that Dr. Vance had been covering up medical errors for years. Sullivan studied the malpractice documents, his expression growing grimmer as he read. "This is way bigger than I realized. We're not just talking about one murder. We're talking about a pattern of cover-ups and potentially multiple suspicious deaths. I've identified 3 other patient deaths in the past 5 years, where Dr. Vance was the attending physician and the circumstances were questionable," Morrison confirmed. "All 3 cases were closed without thorough investigation." "And Maya Rodriguez?" "Maya was selected as a scapegoat because she was young, inexperienced, and from a working-class family. Dr. Vance calculated that she wouldn't have the resources or connections to fight back effectively." Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, staring at the evidence spread across Morrison's desk. "Dr. Morrison, I need to ask you something directly. Why are you doing this? You're destroying your own career to help a nurse you've never worked with." Morrison had been asking himself the same question. His involvement in Maya's case had already made him enemies within the hospital administration, and he knew that taking on Dr. Vance directly would likely cost him his job. But the answer was simple, even if the consequences were complicated. "Because it's the right thing to do," Morrison said. "Because Maya Rodriguez doesn't deserve to go to prison for someone else's crime. Because patients deserve to be protected from healthcare providers who put their own interests above patient safety. Sullivan nodded, apparently satisfied with Morrison's answer. All right, Dr. Morrison, I'm going to need copies of everything you've shown me, and I'm going to need your help building a case that will stand up in court. What about Maya? Can the charges against her be dropped? Not immediately. We need to build our case against Dr. Vance first. Make sure we have enough evidence to secure a conviction. If we move too quickly, Vance might destroy evidence or find ways to discredit what we've discovered. Morrison understood the practical considerations, but he also knew that every day Maya remained under indictment was another day of hell for a young woman who'd already lost everything. How long are we talking about? A few weeks, maybe a month? We need to do this right, Dr. Morrison. One shot is all we'll get. Over the next 2 weeks, Morrison and Sullivan worked together to build an airtight case against Dr. Patricia Vance. Morrison provided medical expertise and access to hospital records, while Sullivan handled the criminal investigation aspects and coordination with the district attorney's office. Their first breakthrough came from the forensic analysis of Harold Chen's body. Morrison had requested that tissue samples be preserved during the original autopsy, and new testing revealed something that the initial examination had missed. Harold Chen hadn't died from respiratory depression caused by morphine overdose. The cause of death was potassium chloride injection, the medical examiner explained to Morrison and Sullivan during a conference call. Someone injected potassium chloride directly into his IV line, which caused immediate cardiac arrest. The morphine was administered post-mortem to create the appearance of an overdose. The revelation changed everything about the case. Harold Chen hadn't died from a medication error. He'd been murdered with a drug that was virtually undetectable unless investigators knew specifically what to look for. Dr. Vance had planned his death meticulously, using her medical knowledge to commit the perfect crime. This was premeditated murder, Sullivan said, his voice grim with the implications. Vance didn't just kill Harold Chen to cover up a malpractice case. She planned it carefully and then framed Maya Rodriguez for a crime that never actually happened. Morrison felt sick as he processed the information. Maya has been torturing herself for months, wondering if she somehow made a mistake that killed Harold Chen. Meanwhile, he was murdered in cold blood by someone he trusted to care for him. The second breakthrough came from Morrison's analysis of Dr. Vance's financial records, which he'd accessed through his administrative privileges at the hospital. What he found was a pattern of financial desperation that provided additional motive for Harold Chen's murder. She's been gambling, Morrison explained to Sullivan as they reviewed credit card statements and bank records. Casino charges, online betting sites, cash advances. She's in debt for nearly $300, and the malpractice lawsuit would have exposed her previous cover-ups, probably resulting in her termination and the end of her medical career, Sullivan added. She was facing financial and professional ruin. So she killed Harold Chen to prevent the lawsuit, framed Maya Rodriguez to avoid investigation, and planned to continue practicing medicine until her retirement next year. Morrison's investigation also revealed the extent of the conspiracy within St. Catherine's Hospital. Dr. Vance hadn't acted entirely alone. She'd had help from individuals within the hospital administration who had covered up her previous mistakes and supported the narrative that blamed Maya Rodriguez for Harold Chen's death. The evidence against Janet Walsh, the hospital administrator, was circumstantial but compelling. Walsh had moved unusually quickly to suspend Maya and support the criminal charges, despite Maya's clean record and the questions that other staff members had raised about the timeline. She'd also restricted access to security footage and pressured staff members not to cooperate with independent investigation. Walsh may not have known about the murder specifically, Morrison told Sullivan, but she definitely knew that the case against Maya didn't add up. She chose to support a false narrative because it protected the hospital from liability. Morrison's most difficult task was approaching other nurses and medical staff who had worked with Maya and might have information relevant to the case. Many of them were afraid to speak out, worried about retaliation from hospital administration or damage to their own careers. Rebecca Torres, the nurse who had worked alongside Maya on the night Harold Chen died, was initially reluctant to get involved. But when Morrison explained the evidence he'd discovered and the implications for Maya's innocence, Torres agreed to provide a statement. "I knew something was wrong that night," Torres told Morrison and Sullivan during a recorded interview. Maya was in room 302 with Mrs. Patterson when the computer logs show her accessing morphine for Mr. Chen. "I saw her there, helping Mrs. Patterson with anti-nausea medication." "Why didn't you speak up earlier?" Sullivan asked. Torres's expression was pained. Dr. Vance told all the staff that questioning the investigation would be considered insubordination, She said that supporting Maya would make us complicit in Mr. Chen's death. We were all scared of losing our jobs. Morrison understood Torres's fear, but he also felt frustrated by the way institutional pressure had silenced people who might have helped Maya months earlier. The hospital's toxic culture of intimidation and retaliation had enabled Dr. Vance's crimes while destroying the life of an innocent colleague. As Morrison and Sullivan built their case, they also began reaching out to Harold Chen's family to prepare them for the revelation that their patriarch's death had been murder rather than medical negligence. The conversation with David Chen, Harold's son who had been pushing for Maya's prosecution, was particularly difficult. "You're telling me that my father was murdered?" David Chen asked, his voice shaking as Morrison explained the evidence they'd discovered. "And this Dr. Vance let an innocent nurse take the blame?" "I'm afraid so," Morrison replied. "Your father was killed because he was going to expose medical malpractice at the hospital. Dr. Vance couldn't let that happen." David Chen was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what Morrison had told him. "That means I've been pushing for the prosecution of an innocent woman. I've been calling Maya Rodriguez a murderer when she was actually trying to save my father's life." "Maya Rodriguez did everything right that night," Morrison assured him. "She discovered your father's cardiac arrest and immediately began CPR. She followed every protocol correctly. If Dr. Vance hadn't intervened, your father might have been saved." The weight of David Chen's misplaced anger and grief was visible in his expression. "I have to make this right. I have to help clear Maya's name and make sure Dr. Vance pays for what she did." Morrison's investigation had taken on a life of its own, growing from a simple review of one suspicious case into a comprehensive examination of systemic corruption at St. Catherine's Hospital. The evidence against Dr. Vance was overwhelming, but Morrison knew that proving her guilt in court would require careful presentation of complex medical and technical evidence. More importantly, Morrison realized that vindicating Maya Rodriguez would require more than just proving her innocence. She would need comprehensive support to rebuild her life, restore her professional reputation, and recover from the trauma of being falsely accused of murder. As Morrison prepared for the final phase of his investigation, the confrontation with Dr. W. Vance and the presentation of evidence to prosecutors, he reflected on how one person's decision to seek the truth had uncovered a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of hospital administration. Maya Rodriguez had been hours away from accepting a plea bargain that would have sent her to prison for a crime she didn't commit. Only Morrison's determination to review the case thoroughly had prevented a catastrophic miscarriage of justice. Now it was time to make sure that the real perpetrators faced the consequences of their actions. Morrison had planned the confrontation with Dr. Patricia Vance carefully, choosing a time when she would be alone in her office and unable to escape or destroy evidence. He arrived at her door at 6 p.m. on a Thursday evening, carrying a manila folder that contained copies of all the evidence he'd assembled over the past month. Dr. Vance looked up from her computer with the same cold expression Morrison had come to associate with her professional persona. At 52, she remained an imposing figure. Silver hair perfectly styled, white coat immaculate, pale blue eyes that seemed to catalog perceived weaknesses in everyone around her. "Dr. Morrison," she said, her voice carrying a note of irritation, "I wasn't expecting you. If this is about staffing issues, perhaps we could discuss them during regular business hours." "It's not about staffing, Patricia. It's about Harold Chen." Morrison watched as Vance's expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded but maintaining the appearance of professional composure. "I'm not sure what you mean. Mr. Chen's case was resolved months ago." "Maya Rodriguez didn't kill Harold Chen," Morrison said, closing the door behind him and taking a seat across from Vance's desk without being invited. "You did." The silence that followed stretched for nearly 30 seconds. Vance stared at Morrison with those pale blue eyes, her face revealing nothing about what she was thinking. When she finally spoke, her voice was perfectly controlled. "That's a very serious accusation, Dr. Morrison. I hope you have substantial evidence to support such a claim." Morrison opened the manila folder and began laying out photographs, documents, and printed screenshots on Vance's desk. "Security footage showing you entering the medication room at 11:58 p.m. using Maya Rodriguez's stolen badge. Pharmacy records proving you accessed controlled substances under her credentials. Timeline documentation showing you in Harold Chen's room during the critical period when he was murdered." Vance glanced at the evidence, but her expression remained unchanged. "Security footage can be misleading, Dr. Morrison. What you're interpreting as suspicious activity could have perfectly innocent explanations." "Could it?" Morrison pulled out additional photographs showing enhanced images of Vance entering Harold Chen's room. These were taken from the hallway cameras. The timestamp shows you entering his room at 12:15 a.m. and remaining there for 4 minutes. Harold Chen was found dead at 3:47 a.m., but the medical examiner has determined that he actually died around midnight. For the first time, Morrison saw a flicker of uncertainty in Vance's eyes. Medical examiners can be wrong about time of death, especially in elderly patients with multiple health conditions. Not when the cause of death was potassium chloride injection, Morrison replied, watching as Vance's carefully controlled facade finally began to crack. Harold Chen didn't die from a morphine overdose, Patricia. He was murdered with an injection that caused immediate cardiac arrest. The morphine was administered post-mortem to create the appearance of medication error. Vance was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded precisely on her desk as she stared at the evidence Morrison had spread in front of her. When she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its commanding authority. "What do you want, James?" Morrison had expected denial, anger, or attempts to discredit the evidence. Vance's immediate shift to negotiation suggested that she understood her position was indefensible. "I want the truth," Morrison replied. "I want Maya Rodriguez's name cleared and her life restored. I want you to face the consequences of what you've done." "You don't understand the complexity of this situation," Vance said, her tone becoming almost plaintive. Harold Chen was going to destroy this hospital with his lawsuit. He was going to expose problems that would have cost hundreds of jobs and harmed thousands of patients who depend on our services. "So you murdered him?" "I prevented a catastrophe that would have had far-reaching consequences beyond one elderly man's life." Morrison stared at Vance in disbelief. Even when confronted with overwhelming evidence of her crimes, she was attempting to justify murder as some kind of utilitarian calculation for the greater good. "You killed an innocent man to cover up your own malpractice, Patricia. Then you destroyed Maya Rodriguez's life to ensure you wouldn't be caught. There's nothing noble or justifiable about what you've done." Vance's composure finally began to deteriorate completely. "You have no idea what pressure I was under. The gambling debts, the threat of exposure, the possibility of losing everything I'd worked for over 25 years in medicine. So you chose to transfer all of that pressure to a 24-year-old nurse who had never done anything wrong?" "Maya Rodriguez was expendable," Vance said, the coldness returning to her voice. "Young nurses make mistakes. It happens all the time. No one would be surprised if she had committed a medication error under pressure." The casual dismissal of Maya as expendable crystallized everything that Morrison found repugnant about Vance's crimes. She had calculated that Maya's life was worth less than her own career and financial security, that a working-class nurse could be sacrificed to protect a senior physician's reputation. "Maya Rodriguez had a spotless record and a bright future," Morrison said, his anger finally breaking through his professional composure. "She spent the last 4 months facing prison, bankruptcy, and the destruction of everything she worked for, all because you decided her life didn't matter as much as your convenience." "It was supposed to be temporary," Vance said, as if that somehow mitigated the enormity of what she'd done. Once the attention died down, once the Chen family moved on, the charges against Maya could have been quietly reduced or dismissed. Morrison realized that Vance had actually convinced herself that framing Maya for murder was some kind of temporary inconvenience rather than a life-destroying accusation. The depth of her narcissism and lack of empathy was breathtaking. The charges weren't going to be quietly dismissed, Patricia. Maya was about to accept a plea bargain that would have sent her to prison for 18 months. She was hours away from admitting to a crime she didn't commit because everyone she trusted had abandoned her. For the first time in their conversation, Vance looked genuinely shaken. "I didn't know about the plea bargain." "Of course you didn't, because you never bothered to check on what happened to the woman whose life you destroyed. Maya Rodriguez was just collateral damage in your plan to save yourself." Morrison gathered the evidence from Vance's desk and returned it to his folder. "The police know everything, Patricia. Detective Sullivan is building a case for first-degree murder, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. The district attorney is preparing to file charges." "What about the hospital?" Vance asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What about the damage this will do to St. Catherine's reputation?" "The hospital administration made their choice when they decided to cover up your crimes rather than seek the truth. Janet Walsh and Richard Stone knew the case against Maya didn't add up, but they chose to protect the institution rather than protect an innocent employee." Vance slumped in her chair, the carefully maintained facade of professional competence finally collapsing completely. "I never meant for it to go this far. I just wanted to prevent the lawsuit, to protect my career until retirement." "You murdered a patient, Patricia. You framed an innocent colleague for that murder. You allowed her to face criminal charges, bankruptcy, and the destruction of her professional reputation. The distance between your intentions and the consequences of your actions doesn't matter. Morrison stood to leave. But Vance's voice stopped him at the door. What happens now? Morrison looked back at the woman who had seemed so intimidating just months earlier. Stripped of her authority and confronted with the evidence of her crimes, Dr. Patricia Vance looked like what she had always been underneath the professional competence. A person who had prioritized her own interests above everything else, including human life. Now you face the consequences of your choices, Morrison said. Just like Maya Rodriguez has been doing for the past 4 months. Morrison left Vance's office and walked directly to the hospital's main lobby, where Detective Sullivan was waiting with 2 patrol officers and a warrant for Dr. Patricia Vance's arrest. Morrison had timed the confrontation to coincide with the police action, ensuring that Vance wouldn't have the opportunity to destroy evidence or flee before being taken into custody. The arrest took place in the hospital's administrative corridor, where Vance's colleagues and subordinates could see her being handcuffed and read her rights. Morrison felt no satisfaction in watching her public humiliation, but he understood that institutional justice required institutional consequences. As the police led Dr. Patricia Vance away from the hospital where she'd worked for 25 years, Morrison reflected on how quickly power and authority could dissolve when confronted with truth and accountability. The woman who had seemed untouchable just hours earlier was now facing the rest of her life in prison. Morrison's next stop was a phone call to Maya Rodriguez, who deserved to hear about Vance's arrest from him rather than from the evening news. Maya, it's Dr. Morrison. Dr. Vance has been arrested for Harold Chen's murder. The charges against you will be dropped within the next 24 hours. The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long that Morrison wondered if Maya had fainted or dropped the phone. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with tears. Is it really over? It's really over, Morrison confirmed. You're free, Maya. Your name is cleared, and everyone will know that you were innocent all along. I don't know how to thank you, Maya said, her voice breaking with emotion. You saved my life. Morrison understood that the formal legal resolution was only the beginning of Maya's recovery. She would need time and support to rebuild her life, restore her professional reputation, and heal from the trauma of being falsely accused. But at least now she would have the opportunity to reclaim her future. The confrontation with Dr. Patricia Vance had taken less than 30 minutes, but its consequences would reverberate through Maya Rodriguez's life, Harold Chen's family, and St. T.D. Catherine's Hospital for years to come. Justice, Morrison reflected, was often a slow process, but when it finally arrived, it could be swift and decisive. The Cook County State's Attorney's Office moved with surprising speed once Detective Sullivan presented the evidence against Dr. Patricia Vance. Within 48 hours of her arrest, prosecutors had filed formal charges of first-degree murder, evidence tampering, identity theft, and conspiracy. The charges against Maya Rodriguez were dropped with a public statement acknowledging that she had been wrongfully accused. Maya's exoneration made front-page news across Chicago, with headlines like "Innocent Nurse Freed After Doctor Arrested for Murder" and "Hospital Cover Up Exposed in Patient Death Case." The same media outlets that had portrayed Maya as a careless killer now told the story of her courage in maintaining her innocence, despite overwhelming pressure to confess to a crime she didn't commit. Maya held a press conference on the steps of the Cook County Courthouse, flanked by Dr. Morrison and her public defender Robert Kim, who had transformed from skeptical advocate to passionate champion once the truth emerged. She was thin and pale, from months of stress and poor nutrition, but her voice was strong and clear as she addressed the assembled reporters. For 4 months, I've been called a murderer, a negligent nurse who killed an innocent man through carelessness, Maya began, her hands shaking slightly as she read from prepared notes. I've lost my job, my home, my savings, and nearly lost my sanity as everyone around me insisted I was guilty of something I knew I hadn't done. Maya paused, gathering herself as camera flashes illuminated her face. I'm here today because one person, Dr. James Morrison, cared enough about the truth to investigate what really happened to Harold Chen. Dr. Morrison saved my life by refusing to accept the easy answers that everyone else was satisfied with. The questions from reporters were sharp and focused, reflecting the public's fascination with the dramatic reversal in the case. Maya handled them with remarkable composure, considering the hell she'd endured over the past months. Miss Rodriguez, how do you feel about Dr. Vance now that you know she was responsible for framing you? Maya's expression hardened slightly. Dr. Vance didn't just kill Harold Chen. She tried to destroy my life to cover up her crime. She calculated that I was expendable, that my future didn't matter as much as protecting herself. I'll never forgive her for that. What are your plans now that you've been cleared? I want to return to nursing, Maya replied without hesitation. Despite everything that's happened, I still believe in the profession. I want to continue caring for patients, and I want to make sure that what happened to me never happens to another healthcare worker. David Chen attended Maya's press conference, his presence a powerful symbol of how completely the narrative around his father's death had changed. The man who had once demanded Maya's prosecution now stood as one of her strongest supporters. Ms. Rodriguez tried to save my father's life, Chen told reporters after Maya finished speaking. She followed every protocol correctly, provided excellent nursing care, and discovered his cardiac arrest immediately. My family owes her an apology for the pain we caused by believing the lies we were told about her role in my father's death. Chen's transformation from adversary to ally was one of the most emotional aspects of Maya's vindication. He had not only withdrawn his civil suit against Maya, but had also filed a wrongful death lawsuit against St. Twain, Catherine's hospital, and Dr. Vance's estate, seeking damages for his father's murder and the cover-up that followed. My father deserved better than to be murdered by someone he trusted, Chen said. Maya Rodriguez deserved better than to be framed for a crime she didn't commit. We're going to make sure that everyone responsible for this conspiracy faces the consequences of their actions. The investigation into St. Catherine's Hospital's role in the cover-up expanded rapidly once federal authorities became involved. The FBI launched a comprehensive review of the hospital's practices, focusing on the pattern of suspicious patient deaths and administrative cover-ups that Dr. Morrison had uncovered. Janet Walsh, the hospital administrator who had orchestrated Maya's suspension and supported the false charges against her, was fired within a week of Dr. Vance's arrest. Her termination came after an emergency meeting of the hospital's board of directors, who were facing potential federal charges for obstruction of justice and conspiracy. The board has lost confidence in Ms. Walsh's ability to lead this institution. Board chairman Dr.com, Elizabeth Hayes announced in a prepared statement. Her role in the wrongful persecution of Maya Rodriguez represents a fundamental failure of leadership and institutional integrity. The financial consequences for St. Catherine's Hospital were devastating. Maya's civil rights lawsuit, filed by a team of attorneys who had offered to represent her pro bono, sought $15 million in damages for wrongful termination, defamation, emotional distress, and violation of constitutional rights. The hospital's insurance company immediately began settlement negotiations, recognizing that Maya's case was virtually unwinnable from a defense perspective. The evidence shows that hospital administrators knew their case against Maya was flawed but chose to pursue it anyway to protect their own interests, explained Maya's lead attorney, Sarah Chen, no relation to Harold, a prominent civil rights lawyer who specialized in institutional misconduct cases. This represents a textbook violation of Ms. Rodriguez's civil rights and professional standing. Dr. Morrison found himself in an unusual position as the investigation expanded. His decision to pursue the truth about Maya's case had made him a hero in the eyes of the media and the nursing community, but it had also made him persona non grata within certain circles of hospital administration. The board of directors ultimately chose to support Morrison publicly, recognizing that his integrity and courage had prevented St. Catherine's from being complicit in a massive miscarriage of justice. He was given a commendation for exemplary leadership in upholding the highest standards of medical ethics and patient care. Dr. Morrison's actions represent the best values of our profession. Dr. Morrison's, Hayes said during the ceremony honoring Morrison's role in exposing the conspiracy. His commitment to truth and justice protected both an innocent colleague and the integrity of this institution. The Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation moved quickly to restore Maya's nursing license, issuing a public statement acknowledging that the original suspension had been based on false information. The state nursing board went further, issuing Maya a commendation for her professional conduct during the crisis and her commitment to patient safety standards. Maya Rodriguez exemplifies the highest standards of nursing practice, the board statement read. Her dedication to patient care and professional integrity, even under extreme pressure, serves as an example to all healthcare providers. Maya's return to work was emotionally overwhelming. Dr. Morrison had personally recruited her to return to St. Catherine's ICU, offering her a position as a senior staff nurse with additional responsibilities for quality assurance and patient safety protocols. "We need nurses like you," Morrison told Maya during their meeting to discuss her return. "People who understand the importance of integrity and won't compromise on patient safety, even when it's difficult or dangerous to speak up." Maya's first day back in the ICU was covered by local news outlets, who documented her return to the profession she had nearly lost forever. Her colleagues, the same people who had once avoided her during the investigation, now welcomed her back with genuine warmth and respect. "We should have supported you," Rebecca Torres told Maya during a break in their shift. "We knew something didn't add up about the case against you, but we were too scared to speak up. You showed more courage than any of us." Maya's response reflected the grace and forgiveness that had sustained her through the darkest period of her life. "I understand why people were scared," she said. "The system was designed to silence anyone who questioned the official narrative. What matters now is that we learn from what happened and make sure it never happens again." Dr. Patricia Vance's trial was scheduled for 6 months later, but her case was resolved much sooner when she agreed to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The plea agreement spared Maya and Harold Chen's family the trauma of a lengthy trial while ensuring that Vance would never be released from prison. During her sentencing hearing, Vance was required to make a statement acknowledging her crimes and their impact on her victims. Her words were brief and seemed inadequate given the magnitude of what she had done. "I take full responsibility for Harold Chen's death and for the harm I caused to Maya Rodriguez," Vance said, reading from a prepared statement. "I allowed my personal problems to compromise my professional judgment, and I made choices that destroyed innocent lives. I will spend the rest of my life trying to understand how I became capable of such actions." Maya attended the sentencing hearing, sitting in the front row where Vance could see her. She later explained that she wanted Vance to face the human consequences of her crimes, to see the person whose life she had nearly destroyed. "I needed her to see that I survived," Maya told reporters after the hearing. "I needed her to know that her attempt to sacrifice me for her own purposes had failed, and that I was strong enough to rebuild my life despite everything she had done." Maya's civil lawsuit against St. Tapper. Catherine's hospital was settled 6 months after her exoneration, with the hospital agreeing to pay $2.3 million in damages and implement comprehensive reforms to prevent future misconduct. The settlement agreement also included a public apology from the hospital's board of directors and a commitment to establish new patient safety and employee protection protocols. The settlement was announced at another press conference, where Maya stood alongside Dr. Morrison and hospital board chairman Dr. Hayes to discuss the reforms that would emerge from the tragedy. "What happened to Maya Rodriguez represents a fundamental failure of our institutional values," Dr. Hayes acknowledged. "We allowed fear of liability and concern for our reputation to override our commitment to truth and justice. The reforms we're implementing today will ensure that employee concerns about patient safety are heard and investigated thoroughly, regardless of who might be implicated." Maya's recovery from the trauma of her wrongful accusation was gradual but steady. She used part of her settlement to establish the Rodriguez Foundation for Healthcare Justice, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting healthcare workers who face retaliation for reporting safety concerns or challenging institutional misconduct. "No healthcare worker should ever have to choose between doing the right thing and keeping their job," Maya explained during the foundation's launch event. "My case shows what can happen when institutions prioritize their own interests over patient safety and employee rights." 1 year after Harold Chen's death, Maya Rodriguez had transformed from a wrongfully accused murder defendant into a national advocate for healthcare worker rights and patient safety. Her story had become a symbol of the importance of individual courage in confronting institutional corruption, and her foundation was already helping other healthcare workers who found themselves in situations similar to what she had experienced. Maya's personal life had also begun to heal. She had entered a relationship with Michael Santos, a fellow nurse who had supported her throughout the investigation and trial. Their relationship was built on mutual respect, shared values, and an understanding of the challenges facing healthcare workers in a complex and sometimes corrupt system. "Maya's strength during the worst period of her life showed me what kind of person she really is," Michael explained to friends who asked about their relationship. "She never gave up on the truth, never compromised her integrity, even when everyone around her was telling her to accept responsibility for something she didn't do." As Maya reflected on her journey from wrongful accusation to vindication and advocacy, she often thought about Harold Chen and the family he had left behind. His murder had been the catalyst for everything that followed: her nightmare, Dr. Morrison's investigation, and ultimately the reforms that would protect future patients and healthcare workers. "Harold Chen deserves so much better than what happened to him," Maya said during one of her foundation's early fundraising events. "He was a sweet man who trusted his healthcare providers to care for him safely. Dr. Vance betrayed that trust in the worst possible way, and then she tried to destroy my life to cover up her betrayal. But Harold's death wasn't meaningless if we learn from it, if we use this tragedy to create positive change that protects other patients and other healthcare workers. That's the legacy I want to build from this experience. Not just my own vindication, but a system that works better for everyone. Maya Rodriguez had entered nursing because she wanted to make a difference in people's lives during their most vulnerable moments. After surviving the worst ordeal of her professional life, she had found a way to make an even greater difference by fighting for justice, integrity, and the protection of those who dedicate their lives to caring for others. Her story had become proof that the truth, no matter how deeply buried or aggressively suppressed, has a way of emerging when someone cares enough to seek it out. And sometimes, that emergence can transform not just individual lives, but entire systems that had lost their way. 2 years after Harold Chen's death, Maya Rodriguez stood in the newly renovated conference room at St. Catherine's Hospital, addressing a group of 50 nursing students from the University of Illinois, Chicago. The room bore her name, the Maya Rodriguez Center for Patient Safety and Nursing Excellence, a tribute to her courage in the face of institutional corruption and her ongoing commitment to healthcare reform. When I first became a nurse, I thought the biggest challenge would be dealing with difficult medical cases or managing the emotional stress of caring for critically ill patients, Maya told the attentive students. I never imagined that the greatest threat to my career would come from within the system I had dedicated my life to serving. Maya had become a sought-after speaker at nursing conferences, medical schools, and healthcare organizations across the country. Her story resonated with healthcare workers who understood how easily they could find themselves in similar situations, caught between institutional pressures and professional integrity, vulnerable to scapegoating when powerful people needed someone to blame for their own failures. The most important lesson I learned from my experience is that documentation and truth-telling are not just professional responsibilities. They're acts of courage that can save lives and careers, Maya continued. Every time you accurately document a patient's condition, every time you speak up about a safety concern, every time you refuse to compromise your professional standards, you're protecting not just your patients but your colleagues and yourself. The students asked thoughtful questions about how to navigate ethical dilemmas, how to report concerns without facing retaliation, and how to maintain hope in a healthcare system that sometimes seemed designed to crush individual integrity. Maya answered each question with the hard-won wisdom that came from surviving the worst possible outcome and emerging stronger on the other side. After the presentation, Maya walked through the ICU where her nightmare had begun. The physical space looked largely the same, but the culture had been transformed by the reforms implemented in the wake of Dr. N.D. Vance's crimes. New oversight procedures ensured that medication errors were investigated thoroughly and fairly. Anonymous reporting systems protected healthcare workers who raised safety concerns. Most importantly, a patient advocate position had been created to provide independent review of cases where staff members faced disciplinary action. Maya's own role at the hospital had evolved far beyond her original nursing duties. As the director of patient safety and staff protection, she oversaw programs designed to prevent the kind of institutional failures that had nearly destroyed her life. Her office was located next to Dr. Morrison's, and they worked together daily to create a culture where truth and transparency were valued above institutional convenience. "How's the Rodriguez Foundation doing?" Dr. Morrison asked, as they reviewed the latest patient safety metrics during their weekly meeting. "We're helping our 15th case this month," Maya replied, reviewing files from healthcare workers around the country who had contacted the foundation for support. A surgical technician in Denver who reported contaminated instruments, a pharmacist in Atlanta who questioned suspicious prescription patterns, a nurse in Miami who refused to falsify documentation to cover up a medication error. The Rodriguez Foundation had grown from Maya's personal mission into a nationally recognized organization that provided legal support, advocacy, and financial assistance to healthcare workers facing retaliation for doing the right thing. The foundation's success had attracted donations from medical organizations, professional associations,